All right, so today we're going to go over how you should be structuring your essays. And this video is for both the AP Lang and the AP Lit class. Without knowing it, each of you wrote a rhetorical analysis. Each of you wrote different rhetorical analyses, but which address different prompts. But the structure of your essays ultimately remain pretty much the same. So if we take a second and look at this first prompt, the following poem is by the 16th century English poet George Gascoigne. Read the poem carefully, then write an essay in which you analyze how the complex attitude of the speaker is developed through such devices such as form, diction, and imagery. The second prompt that was given to the juniors is the passage below is an opening to a speech made in 1960 by American journalist and politician Clare Boothe Luce to journalists at the Women's National Press Club. In this speech, Luce went on to criticize the tendencies of the American press to sacrifice journalistic integrity in favor of the perceived public demand for sensationalist stories. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-developed essay, analyze how Luce uses this introduction to prepare the audience for her message. Support your analysis of her rhetoric with specific references to the text. Now, each of these prompts are asking you to analyze a portion of a specific text and say, notice the word how in each, how something is done. So in the first one, it's how the complex attitude is completed. Complex attitude is delivered. And in the second one, it's how Luce uses this introduction to prepare the audience for the message. The three biggest issues that I saw in everyone's papers, the juniors and the seniors, which is why we're doing this video together, is first and foremost, your thesis does not directly address the prompt. If your thesis in your first paragraph does not address how the complex attitude of the speaker is developed, or how Luce uses his introduction to prepare the audience for her message, you will not write an effective essay. The highest you can get is a 50% if your thesis is not addressing. Now, if your score is over a 50% on this rhetorical analysis in PowerSchools, that does not mean you did this correctly. That means I took pity. Okay? So I want to make that very clear. I was somewhat forgiving if your thesis did not directly address the prompt, but if you are taking an AP test or if you were writing in college, the person grading your work will not be this forgiving. Okay? Especially at this point in the year, we shouldn't have to have the discussion of, do you have a clear thesis that addresses the prompt? No, we started with this in week 1 in both classes. Okay? It is unforgivable at this point in time if you do not have a thesis that doesn't address the prompt. It's even more unforgivable if you don't have a thesis, which for about 50% of you, it's about 10 out of 20 total, because there are 12 in the 11th grade class and 8 in the 12th grade class, about 10 of you didn't have a thesis, period. That is ridiculous, okay? Your thesis must address the prompt. The second biggest problem I had is your paragraphs lack guidance or do not follow the appropriate format. Again, one of the first things we did in the beginning of the year was learn how to deconstruct the prompt and make an outline that addresses. That was supposed to help you so that your essay had guidance, right? But what I'm really talking about when I talk about paragraphs lacking guidance or not following the appropriate format is that you do not have a claim evidence warrant, which is why we did that activity last week where you were supposed to highlight your claim evidence warrant. Some of you pretended that you had all three of these in your paragraphs when you clearly did not. You need to have a topic sentence for each of your paragraphs that addresses your rhetorical analysis. Your thesis, If you don't have a topic sentence that starts off that says, hey, this person does this, your paragraph lacks guidance and you open the door, as I commented on many of your essays, in doing this, you open the door to lead yourself to summary. Some of you were complaining, especially the juniors, going out to you guys, complaining that I write not to summarize a lot, but I never say what I mean by that. Well, what I mean is you have no direction in your paragraph, none. And because you don't have any direction, you do what normal people do when they're struggling, and you throw what you know up there, which is what the reader already read. Okay? You have to make a claim so that you can then give evidence to support that claim, because you quoting something when you don't have any claim is pointless, right? And then you can give your warrant. If you don't have that claim, the rest of your essay crumbles, literally crumbles. It can't stand without that. The third issue, which wasn't as big of an issue in the beginning of the year, but now is really, it's becoming a problem. Your quotes are incredibly too long. And I commented on a lot of your essays, and it's probably the first time you've seen this, because I am nitpicking a little bit more because we are this late in the year, and it's such a bad problem. It was getting on my nerves. By the third or fourth essay, I was pulling my hair out looking at this. You should not be quoting an entire line from the text. There are very, very few cases in which quoting an entire line is acceptable. Okay? And I'll show you what I mean by that. We are going to look at examples of all three of this, but shorthand, use what you only need. So use the bare minimum for quotes, because when you're quoting entire lines, you're opening the door for yourself to not have a lot of room to explain without rambling, right? Because you've said everything. You gave away all the juicy details before you started your story. And you essentially open yourself up to not have an analysis, right? You're just quoting, and we never hear you. So the words of others, or the words of the text itself, are outweighing your analysis, and that is a huge problem. Not to mention, quoting on a timed essay takes incredibly way too long. So what we're going to do is you need to, all of you, this applies to every single one of you, look at these three issues. I do not want to see these three issues in any other essay that you write for me again. I don't. We're not going to have this problem, okay? What we'll do in the rest of this video, and probably we'll run into a second video, it depends, is I'm going to go through, I have examples from the different essays that I read. Not all the essays, but some. I just pulled some random examples. They're completely anonymous, but do know that every one of these came from somebody that wrote a rhetorical analysis on this last turn. And we're going to look at examples of what I'm talking about, like versus what was done not so well and what was done well. Okay? So if we go down a little bit, we're going to start with your thesis does not directly address the prompt. So when I'm talking about your thesis not addressing the prompt, remember each of these prompts, whether you had the 11th grade AP Lang or the 12th grade AP Lit prompt, addresses how something is done. So we're discussing rhetoric, okay? In your thesis, which it doesn't matter if your introductory paragraph is long or not, right? Because we want to get to the point, you know, we don't want to beat around the bush with this. You need to have at least one sentence that directly references the prompt, okay? So if you're saying that in the poetry example that Gaston uses diction and, repetition to create a mysterious tone that creates ambiguity, then that's your thesis, okay? So let's look at this first example. The poem For That He Looked Not Upon Her, written by George Gascon, an English poet who is well known for his work, including the poem For That He Looked Not Upon Her, which is a Shakespearean sonnet, the poet to tell a story about a toxic relationship that affected the speaker in the poem deeply. The poet expresses their emotions throughout the poem and how this toxic relationship is affected his present life. Okay, so there are some grammatical errors here, which is besides the point. That's not what we're looking at. But if we're looking for a thesis, one, this is one whole sentence, which it shouldn't be. And two, the closest thing we get to a thesis is the poet expresses their emotions throughout the poem and how this toxic relationship is affected life. It barely hints at the prompt, and it doesn't really fully address it because it doesn't say how. Okay, so yeah, we know this thing exists. The prompt gave us a big idea of, hey, this thing is there. Just tell us how it's done, right? But this doesn't say how it's done. In fact, the word how is again repeated here. Now, we can fix something like this by giving the how. So if we look at the second example, human imperfection and sinning is consistently used as a basis of literary comedic. We don't need this fluff, all right? But, you have fluff. That's great. Lovely. Beautiful. Throughout the poem, Gascon illustrates his mental struggle between succumbing and resisting to lust with his manipulation of form to illustrate shifts in thought, diction, and negative connotations and grave imagery. So we know that this person in their essay is going to talk about the manipulation of form, right? So there's some sort of structure that we're playing with. Diction of negative connotations and grave imagery. So it's not just imagery, it's grave imagery. We're talking specifically about something that we're going to do. The reader of this particular essay, just from those first couple sentences, first 3 sentences, right, knows exactly what's going to be discussed in the rest of this essay. There's a very clear direction. Every paragraph will relate to this sentence. Okay? If you start off strong with a thesis that answers the specific prompt, you set yourself up to be able to create a strong essay. Now, I have an example of this that I would normally show you with Jenga blocks, and I'll try to make a video of it later. But essentially, the concept is, if this part of your essay or your analysis is not strong, the rest of your essay crumbles. Okay? So aim for something, aim for one sentence, and perhaps we could do an activity with this later on, that directly addresses the prompt. I cannot say that enough. If it doesn't address the prompt, I'm not even kidding you. If you are taking the AP test, the highest you can get is a 50% on this particular score. Okay? You have to address the prompt. If you're not taking the AP test, this is still really important, because if you write any essay, for me, for example, with seniors, this is coming down the pike for you, or in college, any type of research paper, anything, you have to have a very clear thesis so that your paper is given direction. Now, paragraphs lack guidance, do not follow appropriate format. Again, when I mentioned this earlier, I talked about having claim, evidence, warrant. I know that we've discussed claim, evidence, warrant, especially with the juniors. Seniors, we did this, we hinted at it. It's something, we did do a lesson on it, but it really is something you should have been doing this entire time. You may have learned it as you have a topic sentence and then supporting sentences and then a concluding sentence, but it's more or less the same thing. So what am I talking about when I'm saying you don't have an appropriate format? If we look at this paragraph, Clare Boothe Luce went to the press hoping for change. Okay. This sentence on itself tells me nothing about this paragraph. Let's see if the second sentence does. She started her speech by acknowledging that she is happy and flattered to be a guest of honor. This is true for those of you that didn't read the speech. She does start by saying, I'm flattered, I'm the guest of honor, blah, blah, blah. And then we get directly into quotations. But here's the problem. Now, officially at this point, we're halfway through the paragraph. I still don't know what you're talking about. There's no direction, none. I have no idea. If you're saying she went to the press hoping for change, great, okay. So that doesn't address the prompt. It doesn't address the thesis you should have had, right? She knows what she's doing is risky. Again, another quote, which gets into my last point we're going to talk about later, telling them she's not here to give them a speech about all the right things they are doing, but rather they're doing wrong. Blah, blah, blah. You asked me to tell you what's wrong with you. She makes a clear point. She did not volunteer to criticize them and urge them. Okay, this entire paragraph, summary. Summary. It's not analysis, point blank. Okay, an analysis says something about how something is done. This does not. Most of your paragraphs, 11th and 12th grade, did not tell me anything. Nothing. If I was lucky, I got 2 sentences in probably your whole essay. Okay? You have to start with a topic sentence that makes a claim so that you can get your point across. Okay? If you start with a claim here, for example, okay, so she wanted change. She went to the press hoping to change. Okay, so what did she do to evoke that change? How did she how did she attempt to evoke that change?